Tell the truth. Don't be bullshitting people. Like I say, there's enough bullshit as it is. There's enough bullshit as it is. In fact, there's just enough. Did you know that? There's just enough bullshit to hold things together in this country. Bullshit is the glue that binds us as a nation. Where would we be without our safe, familiar American bullshit? Land of the free, home of the brave, the American dream. All men are equal, justice is blind, the press is free, your vote counts. Business is honest, the good guys win, the police are on your side, God is watching you, your standard of living will never decline, and everything is going to be just fine. The official national bullshit story. I call it the American okey doke. Every one of those items is provably untrue at one level or another, but we believe them because they're pounded into our heads from the time we're children. That's what they do with that kind of stuff. They put it in the heads of kids. They pound it in there because they know kids are too young to be able to mount a sophisticated argument against these kind of ideas. And so kids, and up to a certain age, by the way, kids are going to believe everything a grown-up tells them, everything. So kids never learn to question things. Nobody questions things in this country anymore. Nobody questions things. Why? People are too fat and happy. People are way too fucking prosperous for their own good. Everyone's got a cell phone that'll make pancakes and rub their balls now, you know? So nobody wants to rock the boat. And people just gizmo. Americans have been bought off and silenced by gizmos and toys. And as a result, no one's ever learned to question things. No one questions things in this country anymore. No one questions things. Now, okay.
And that was the late and great George Carlin, who unfortunately died in 2008, coincidentally the same year the Zeitgeist movement was formed. He was a fantastic comedian. I really recommend everyone check out his HBO specials, which spanned decades of fantastic comedy. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Zeitgeist Movement Podcast Australia. My name's Zac, and I'm here with my friend Casey. Today we kind of started in the middle of our interview. We were kind of talking a little bit off air before we started recording. And when we started recording, we started with talking about site-specific irrationality and go from there. But I think it's a really good podcast and I hope you enjoy it.
This is something Joe and I talked about, the site-specific rationality that religion encourages, I should say, because with religion, you'll have these very smart people, scientists, people who are very reasonable and rational and critically thinking most of the time, but with religion, they don't. So they're taught that with all other aspects of life, you ask questions, you evaluate, you look at the evidence and so on, but with religion, you don't do that.
So what's this got to do with like censoring yourself?
So you become site-specific in your irrationality, but then you forget when to be irrational and when not to be. Say you're a doctor. You need to be very rational when diagnosing, when prescribing medicines and so on. But if you're also religious, which is like common, it's not a crazy thing, you're totally irrational because the Bible, religion in general are very stupid and irrational things to believe, right? So they have to turn it off and on. And when it's not a universal principle of just questioning things or being rational or being highly critical or something, you forget when to turn it on and when to turn it off.
Okay. Yeah,
so that's something that you observe in lots of different fields, not just rationality and things and not just religion, but like censoring yourself. Like when I'm on the podcast and I'm high, I'm way more articulate and just let it all flow because all the things that I think inside just come out.
Yeah.
But when I'm not high, I'm generally more censored because in real life you are generally more censored.
Okay, but you weren't brought up with a religious upbringing. So no, where do you think that came from?
It's not just religion, but religion does permeate all of society. Like, even if you're not religious yourself, your family isn't. Like, my family wasn't. I'm third generation non-religious. My grandparents were the ones that at 14 and 15 said, fuck religion's dumb, I'm not going to church. And then both my parents didn't go to church, and then like me and Jeremy, they're totally not religious.
But you would say that the reason that you censor yourself on the podcast is because because our whole society is based on religion,
But our whole society is based on irrationality. That's the whole thing, where you have to be site-specific, where there are no universal rules because...
So do you think it's irrational to censor yourself sometimes?
It's very reasonable and rational to censor yourself in this society because you have to function within this society.
So it's not irrational then?
No.
So actually...
Point is that the society is very irrational. There are no universal principles because we have thousands of people starving in Africa, and yet one person dies in Australia, we care about that one person. We have all these double standards. Everywhere in society is permeated with double standards and things where you give preferential treatment to some groups and so on. It's not just religion, but religion is a great example where every part of society is irrational, where things are given value, things are given priority where it shouldn't or it should, and things...
But I still wonder where your feeling towards censoring yourself comes from.
Because that's what I'm talking about, the site-specific...
What are you worried about?
It's more of a signal error, like a biological signal error. Because
from yourself?
Yeah, because you are site-specific in your rationality, you're site-specific in your censoring, because in normal life you censor yourself. Like if I go to uni, I'm going to be a slightly different person than I would be with you because I know you more and I kind of open up a bit more. But with, people I don't know, I kind of put and this is very common, this is just not something to do with me. This is a mask or something, or a slight front of you give away a certain amount, but you kind of leave that door closed at a certain point.
And that's where it's hard on a podcast. You realize that you're in this space where you could potentially have thousands of people listening to you.
No, it's not that at all. I mean, I don't really care about that. It's the signal error of not knowing when to turn that censoring on and off. So it's with the...
But when you're high, you just don't care.
Yeah, well, with drugs inherently reduce your inhibitions.
Yeah.
So kind of, in a way, reveals the more true you. Alcohol, I kind of think of it as, and this is also supported by science, is that you have kind of animal impulses from the lower brain, which are more uncensored. They're sexual impulses, they're food impulses, they're things that are generally regulated by the upper part of your brain. And then alcohol or drugs in general inhibit that
regulation,
and then it all comes out who you really are in terms of an animal. And to bring it back to a real case of Phineas Gage, the guy who had the brain injury of a metal pole going through his brain. He was this very respectable member of society and so on. And then he had that metal pole take out his frontal cortex, and the very next day, because he survived, it was hot enough and fast enough that it just sealed.
Yeah.
He became this animal, promiscuous, predatory guy.
Yeah.
Because that is the regulatory mechanism being shut off. Wow. And then the animal instincts coming out. And that is kind of what you observe if you take a step back and look at the broad effects of alcohol and drugs in general, is that it inhibits your regulation of impulses.
Did you ever hear of Jeannie? She was a girl who, it's a really tragic story actually. Her father kept her locked up in a dungeon or something her whole life.
I am aware of this one.
Yeah, and she was in a dark space. She never learnt how to go to the toilet properly or anything like that. And when they eventually got her out, I think she was already a teenager by that time. Yeah,
she was barking, walking on all fours.
I don't remember that. I remember she was masturbating on everything. And she had they couldn't train her to stop doing that. Yeah. And she couldn't speak properly. She couldn't even go to the toilet properly or anything. She would just pee anywhere and stuff like that. Because of course she hadn't been taught those things. But you're talking about becoming a predator or something like that. And I think of that story in a way that's she's not the same thing. She never was really regulated.
To bring it back, the reason why human beings do that site-specific rationality and that site-specific censoring is because we are a social species and it is socially acceptable to behave differently in different situations. So when you're first meeting someone, you kind of conduct your behavior in a certain way. But when you're like long-time friends, it's okay to kind of open up a bit more and exchange and so on.
Yeah.
But like, it would be inappropriate if I was just meeting someone to like give them my whole life story and all my worries and stuff. Whereas like, if we were chatting, that would be like acceptable behavior.
I also think it might, actually I wanted to talk about this, about making jokes, about making inappropriate jokes, because sometimes when you first meet someone, you don't actually know what their biases really are, and whether they really are bigots or whether they're really open or whether they're really good critical thinkers or not, and things like that. So last week, or the week before, we went to Simon's place, one of our friends who will be on the podcast. We were just hanging out and we made some really inappropriate jokes around each other.
Because, for those who don't know, like, all of us, or I thought all of us, are really, really non-racist, non-homophobic, really accepting of all the differences, and all very much for equality, you know, non-gender discrimination, non-race discrimination.
Because we realise that the problems in the world are systematic problems, and so...
Systemic.
Whatever. Yeah, systemic problems.
And that the differences are only surface deep. Like, we literally are one family. All the differences are very much attributable to biology, prenatal effects, childhood experiences, and so on. So to judge someone for their differences is really
as in
quite
their
wrong.
skin colour or something ridiculous.
It's really
like
dumb
that.
and stupid.
Yeah. So.
But like, because we are so accepting of that, we can make these ridiculous jokes. Like, because the people were joking about it from Africa, and I said something like really, like, super over the top, that's the point, racist about like, oh, it's fucking Africans or something. I don't even remember the
Yeah,
joke.
it was just something dumb and we all just laughed. But then our friends actually were really quite taken back by that.
Because they were from the culture where it's really not acceptable to do that, because there is real racism in South Africa.
Yeah.
And that, to them, was seen as quite inappropriate. And this is another thing I'd like to bring up with that site-specific irrationality, site-specific censoring, and site-specific censoring with relation to jokes and so on. I don't believe in site-specific stuff at all. I think there should always be universal rules. And I think as soon as you have one group or whatever that you can't joke about, then that starts going to other things. So I love, on purpose, joking and making really offensive jokes about everyone and everything, especially
Okay, I disagree.
No, but let me finish.
Okay.
So, like, for instance, Simon is gay, but I'll make, like, homophobic jokes that are over-the-top homophobic that I don't mean clearly to, like, just rile him up because it's funny.
Yeah, and I guess if he's aware that you're not homophobic at all, like, and you have the confidence in that because you're close friends, then it's okay.
But if I said that to a gay guy that I just met, not okay. And that's what I mean about conducting yourself.
So you don't believe in having site-specific censorship? Like, you think that you should be able to make those kind of jokes in front
Absolutely, yeah.
But we don't have people with critical minds. You're just saying that with this irrational
and that's
society.
where I will accept the site-specific rationality or the site-specific censoring in certain social situations in terms of how well you know the person. Like, so when you first, there's always going to be that. So when you first meet someone, you're not going to talk to them and conduct your behavior in the same way as if you're been friends for 10 years.
Yeah,
right?
no way.
So, like, if I had a phone call from someone and it's someone I met once, I would probably be a little bit more formal, a bit more polite than if I'm like, oh, hey, Casey, what's up, you know?
I'll say something way more inappropriate than that.
Yeah.
So,
Which, you know, for the podcast, I won't say.
Yeah. Because you're doing site-specific censorship.
But in terms of...
And if you were high, you probably would just say it.
But in terms of joking, I really don't think it's appropriate to legislate things you can't joke about. And I really appreciate the comedy of people who don't and go out of their way, in fact, to joke about things that are really, really inappropriate. For instance, Louis C.K.'s was the host of the last episode of Saturday Night Live.
Was he?
And he did this super inappropriate joke about pedophiles. And he's like, his joke was, so I really love Mars bars. And I can't even do anything else when I eat a Mars bar. When I have a Mars bar, I have to stop everything and just, And then he's like, but if someone said I was going to go to jail for eating a Mars bar, I would stop eating them. So pedophiles who have sex with children.
Oh god, that's so bad.
What it really means is like having sex with children must be really good.
Oh my god, that's really fucked up.
And you can even hear the audience like seeing
Just
where
go,
the joke is going,
"Oh,
like,
this is
oh
so
no.
far."
But
Yeah.
it's funny as hell, right?
Okay, it might be for someone like you, but I can understand why people would have a problem with it, because that's going out to an audience where there would be potential pedophiles watching. And you know, I've heard this saying before, I don't know if I believe it, but sometimes I do. There's a hint of truth in everything sarcastic. Right? And so you get someone who actually does
because
this.
pedophiles, I mean, why do they do it? Like, but my point is, to bring it back to something practical, is if you can't joke about it, you can't talk about it. And if you can't talk about it, you can't address the issue. So I really think that no matter how grotesque or whatever the issue is, and you think it's very clear cut or something, if you can't talk about it, that's a barrier to solving that problem.
Yeah. And it's really
if you
hard
can't
to know
talk about it, you have to be able to joke about something to talk about it.
It's really hard to know where to draw the line.
But there is no line. That's the whole point. There are no lines. That's something Bill Hicks talked about. When he was asked about because his work got censored a lot. His work could be shown on some UK television where they allowed swearing and really inappropriate stuff and sexual graphic language and stuff. But on the States, it wasn't allowed. And he was being interviewed about, so where do you draw the line? What should be allowed to be shown on TV? And he's like, no lines. You should be able to do anything. Like, they're just words. They're just jokes after all. I'm a joke blower.
I just think that we don't have a critical enough population I just think, like, okay, say you made some kind of racist joke to a particular audience that had racist kind of tendencies, and even if it's said in a sarcastic way, if you've got, like, a population that actually thinks that black people are stupid or, like, you know, they don't deserve as much as other people, and then they make a joke that kind of, you know, encourages that way of thinking, then you kind of encourage that culture. And unless you actually...
If it's clearly sarcastic or it's clearly a joke, I think it's okay. And I also think that you're kind of reverse...
Who's it clear to?
Smart people, I know. But I think you're also reverse engineering the dumb people to exist. Because if you treat them like idiots, then they'll behave like idiots. If you treat them like they're never going to understand a joke, then they won't understand it. But that's what, again, Bill Hicks talked about, like, they treat you so dumb on the TV. Like, one of his jokes, he mentions Jesus. And then the channel got all these letters like, oh, you talked about Jesus. And he's like, I did not say Jesus was bad. I just mentioned Jesus' name. And like, when you treat people dumb, they will behave dumb. And if you assume that they will get it and they'll understand, they probably will. Like, more, and I think, again, you're not giving people enough credit for... And again, if someone gets offended, like, who cares?
What about if we were to say, like, I don't know, you think that we should give people that much credit? I don't know. I feel like we do live in a society of stupidity.
So how do you get out of that, though? How do you get out of that? Well, you treat people smart. You treat people with respect, and they'll become what you treat them to be.
Yes, but you're not going to do that through just sarcastic humor. You have to actually educate these people. And then I think comedy is a great tool for education. Once they understand evolution and they understand that people are not the product of their, racial background or their whatever, then you can see that as ridiculous and funny. But until that time, the only reason it is actually funny is because people are actually racist and because people are actually sexist. If there was no such thing as that, it wouldn't even be funny. Yeah, because it wouldn't be a thing to joke about. Yeah. But that's what it is. It's ridiculing the stupid people, and the stupid people are looked down on in society as being racist or bigots or whatever, and they stop being that, I think. When they see that. Because if a comedian jokes about how, and has a really good and succinct joke about how ridiculous it is to judge people for their race, and then you actually do it, you're kind of socially shunned. So what because comedy is a great way to cut into a kind of society's perception of an issue. What about the pedophile joke, though? Louis C.K. I thought it was funny as hell. Imagine a pedophile seeing that? What do you think of that? How do you think a pedophile will perceive that? Do you think they're going to go, oh yeah, that does sound ridiculous now. I'll stop being a pedophile now. Do you think that's going to have that kind of effect on somebody like that? Somebody who's already committed those crimes, gone to jail for it, had to tell everyone in their neighborhood, still has fantasies like that, and then they hear a joke like that. You think that actually is going to change the way they behave?
No, I don't. But I think that being able to joke about something allows you to talk about an issue, and talking about an issue is how you solve an issue. The question is not, is that pedophile, now that they saw a funny joke, going to stop? No, I'm not saying that. Okay. I'm saying the society at large, after being able to joke about something, can talk about that issue.
Yeah.
Once they can talk about that issue, they can get to the root causes. Why are people pedophiles? That's something that needs to be talked about.
I guess you're right, because it's like, wow, that is such an outrageous comment. I don't know why I'm so enraged by that joke. Yes, we do need to address this. Yeah. I guess that, I get you. I get what you mean.
So then we talk about, well, why? It's because we have a fucking fucked up culture in terms of sexual repression. We have a fucked up culture in terms of many things.
Yeah.
We have so many double standards, so many things that are wrong. It's not surprising, really, that people are fucked up.
Yeah, and that people are doing things like that.
Yeah. So it is, again, a tool to get issues talked about. Once you joke about an inappropriate or fringe or taboo topic, you can now talk about it. Once you can talk about it, you can begin solving it. But you can't solve a problem you can't talk about. You have to identify a problem before you can start solving it.
Yeah. Okay, I get what you mean now. I think I definitely feel on the same level with that.
Do you think it's acceptable to joke about anything?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm not actually saying you shouldn't be able to make that pedophile joke. I'm just trying to understand how that's helpful for someone who is not critical minded. But I kind of get what you mean now, because you're not talking about how that's going to change that one person's life. You're talking about how society in general can deal with an issue after they've talked about it and there's no taboo subjects. I get that now.
Now, to bring it back to the being site-specific with what is acceptable and what is not, if there is now one thing, say it was not okay to joke about something, then it's very easy to rationalize to not be able to joke about and therefore not talk about other issues. So if you're not allowed to talk about or joke about cults or how dumb religion is or how stupid homophobia is or anything like that, then it's very easy for the ruling class to go, oh, that's an issue that is not allowed to be talked about, not allowed to be addressed. We can now use that same kind of irrationality to justify not talking about something else. Talking about the power structure that controls this society. Talking about how inappropriate it is to have banks and things ruling our society.
Yeah.
If you can't joke about something, even if it's just one thing, you can generalize that argument and make it for something else. And then you have all these things you can joke about and all these things you can't joke about, and then you have this confusion, which is what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, and that's where you get that site-specific rationality, which is a really bad thing because that discourages universal rules. And universal rules are ways to dismantle double standards.
Okay, cool. You've convinced me. Yeah.
Good.
Well,
Good.
Yeah, I feel like I'm like, no, I've always believed that it'll probably be funny to listen to this and realize that you've actually made some kind of impact on what I think.
Because
in terms of that.
What we really need is a universal set of standards or morals where if I treat someone with respect, they treat me with respect. It's not okay for me to hurt you because it's not okay for you to hurt me. You know, it's not okay for 10 people in Africa to die any more than it's okay for 10 people in Australia to die. A universal set of standards and rules that is rational and reasonable. It's not okay for me to do something, but it's not. Basically, the government is a double standard. It's okay for the government to spy on us, but it's not okay for us to spy on the government.
Or on other people.
Yeah, it's okay for the government to use force against us. It's not okay for us to use force against it. That's all double standards. If you have a society of universal principles and universal laws, I guess, then a government can't exist because a government is predicated on a double standard.
It's a difficult thing, though, because the only things that we can truly say are universal are the laws of nature. So,
But we'll develop.
There is a universal law that, 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah,
Or
but I'm talking about social.
Yes, I know, but they're not
things.
black and white. And that's
No,
why
but they
we
very
struggle.
much are, actually. Like,
How can you say
it's not appropriate. If it's okay to hurt someone else, why is it not okay for them to hurt you? If it's okay for you...
That's a very grey area. So you're saying that an eye for an eye is okay?
No, I'm saying if you're justifying your thing, because basically a government it's okay for us to do it, but it's not okay for you to do it. It's basically a double standard. If you eliminate double standards, it's very hard to say like, well, I deserve more, but you all don't.
How do you regulate it if somebody breaks those universal laws? Because
social shunning, basically if they are the values
isolating them.
Well, if it's the values held by the society, then it just won't be done. Basically, it's like
it sounds very idealistic, don't you?
No, but it's actually how societies work. You have laws, which are just the finer, I guess, regulatory mechanisms on what is already not socially acceptable to do. For instance, like things, I'm trying to think of a really good example of things that are not socially acceptable, but just like
killing someone? Or?
Burping loudly at a party, it's socially frowned upon, so you avoid doing it because there's nothing to be gained, because you lose. So you act and behave in a certain way based on what is socially acceptable. And if you have a set of values in your society that kind of fine-tune what is socially acceptable, which are values that are universal, then you'll get a society that is far more productive.
But it's not that simple.
I think it is, though, because right now we have what is socially acceptable is very much double standards.
Yeah, I understand the difference between the fact that the government gets away with a lot of bullshit and the banks, and basically anyone with money, anyone with any corporate interest gets away with a lot more than the rest of the world, because that's the way the system is.
But even the way problems are perceived, like if someone in Australia is murdered by a Muslim Arab, people would lose their shit. But if a Muslim Arab was murdered by a Muslim Arab in Iraq, no one cares, right? And that's a double standard.
I was basically talking about how it's not that simple. There are grey areas, especially when you talk about things like as simple as burping at a party or something like that. Because it's not the fact that we don't share. Well, I mean, in some cultures, burping at the dinner table is actually polite because it shows that
was just an arbitrary example.
But it's not. If you think about that, that is still something that we've constructed.
Yeah, in our society.
We've decided that, so it's not universal.
I'm not saying it is. That's an arbitrary example.
Even killing someone isn't a universal, thing that...
And that's what we'll have. We'll have a global set of universal principles of what is acceptable behavior and what is not. Hurting people is not acceptable. Hurting animals is not acceptable. Being unsustainable is not acceptable. Hurting the environment is not acceptable.
So what is if we just say that, if we just put a ground rule out that say all these things are unacceptable, then what is the punishment if someone breaks those rules? And you can say to me...
There's no punishment.
Look, you can set up an education system. The whole system would encompass education in which people would share those values. So everyone would actually believe all of those values anyway. And so the likelihood of them being broken is a lot lower.
Okay.
But there are always going to be circumstances where people do.
Yes, okay, I agree. So first of all, I'll address one point that you made earlier, which is the word punishment. Like, I don't really believe in punishment at all. I don't think it's an appropriate thing for a civilized society to have, because you can't hold people accountable for some of their actions. And the level of free will is kind of determined on their biology. Again, bringing it back to Robert Sapolsky's lecture series, which really opened my eyes in terms of how much people are responsible for their actions. And the whole legal system at the moment is predicated on finding who is the person at fault, who is the person responsible for this bad thing happening, which cost us X number of dollars, and that needs to be remedied by who, basically. So I don't also agree with jails at all, or prisons, because basically you can have someone who's dangerous to your society and that needs to be addressed, but punishing someone for bad behavior, especially when it's a victimless crime like drug use for themselves or something, or possession, or a lot of these really crazy things that are technically crimes in our society but aren't really damaging to anyone other than the individual themselves, which is their personal choice. So I don't agree with punishment. I think if there's someone who's violent and disruptive to society, there needs to be a way to address that person. But I think that'll be vastly reduced in a society.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a future here where we've already created something like a resource-based economy,
Yeah.
and people have been brought up in that system. But I guess I'm talking about where we are now and how we get to that point.
How we get there is we start behaving like we're in a resource-based economy. So how do you get somewhere? Well, it's a slow transition usually of from the point you are now to the point you want to be. What is difference between here and there? And we start adopting those changes. So if we want a more egalitarian society, we behave more egalitarianly. If we want a more sustainable society, we be more sustainable.
Why do you think it is then that we have a lot of people who want a more egalitarian society, and they might start their own little commune or whatever, or, you know, even people within the Zeitgeist movement, there seems to be, I guess, conflict between those people. I mean, I guess this is a rhetorical question, because what I'm saying is people who are brought up in this system and as a child find it very difficult to let go of things like ego.
Yeah.
And it's actually something that isn't as simple as flicking a switch and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I don't believe in the principles of this system anymore, so I'm going to start behaving this way.
It's indoctrination into the money worship and money market system. But to
Yeah.
be fair, like, as much as I understand about human biology, human behavior, the way society values are constructed and so on, I couldn't live on a completely egalitarian community of 80 people. It just wouldn't work. I wouldn't be able to let go. And that's why I also think that transitions, especially social transitions, are always multi-generational.
Yeah.
You see things die out in the way that people don't experience them anymore because they didn't exist. Like, I think every child today that is born from now on will accept global warming is created by humans and that it needs to be addressed. Like, that's a fairly socially acceptable thing to believe, whereas the people who are actually guiding the decisions right now are basically older, like generally people in leadership positions are, 60 and so on. They were brought up in a different society where it wasn't really acceptable. It was more of a fringe idea, and they're the people guiding the decisions today.
Yeah.
So, and again, racism, it takes a long time. Like for me, someone who had international students living with me since I was like 4 years old. When I was living in Sydney, we had Germans and people from South America and everywhere. So the idea of racism is such a foreign concept to me. I thought it was a joke. So my children, and again, my children are not going to be racist, and it'll just slowly die out as for other factors as well, that the world is becoming more globalized and people are moving countries like they've never been able to before. And again, with religion, it dies out over time. Like, I'm kind of the first completely non-religious person because not only
in the world,
in my family, because it's an intergenerational thing. My grandparents are the ones that were brought up religious and said, no, this is stupid at 13 or 14 or so on, and stopped going. And then, but they still had a little bit of influence because it affects you, right? Then my parents were the ones that were not brought up religiously. So they weren't forced to go to church, Sunday school, nothing like that. But there was still that inherent bit from their parents.
Yeah.
But now my parents, who are very much non-religious, or my mum is anyway, me and my brother, me in particular, it's just a foreign concept. Religion sounds like something that I can't even understand. The idea that you would believe in God or that you would go to church and worship and pray and all this stuff, it's such a foreign concept to me, it's hard for me to even understand it. And the same thing would go with racism and homophobia and things. Like, being homophobic is really socially unacceptable now, but because the people who rule the society are still kind of stuck in the past, they're 60-year-olds and stuff like that, they still have that prejudice built in from when they were children,
I still don't think we've come as far with homophobia, to be honest, because I still
But do you
find
really
people
think
my
that...
age who are homophobic.
Well, yes. And again, it's not a universally even distribution. It happens in different families at different times. Like, I'm one of the first in my family to be completely non-religious, but there are other people in different stages where, like, for instance, your parents might have been religious, so you're like halfway there, and your kids, if you have them, will be completely non-religious. Behaviors and cultures change and die out, and new ones emerge. So,
what I'm concerned about in terms of that, you know, a lot of people discover the concepts of a resource-based economy, or, you know, just the train of thought of the Zeitgeist movement, and actually learn about the state of the world and how urgently we need to change it. And then we're like, oh, well, you know, nothing's ever going to change within the next couple of years. This is going to be an intergenerational change. And people freak out because they think, but we need to do this now.
Well,
we need to do this yesterday. So
I agree, and I point out why there's this conflict and why there is a certain urgency, because change in the world is happening faster now than ever. There is so much happening every single year. Things are deteriorating. Technology is emerging faster than ever. Human history is being written faster and faster. New events are happening all the time. But still, you know, a generation is 25 years.
Yeah.
So we have these old values, this cultural baggage, this cultural lag of these old ideologies that are no longer relevant to the society that we're living in.
Yeah.
And all these people that are living in past values, where the society as it is today really needs kind of a clean slate of perception, where we can't really look at things like we did 50 years ago, because things are so much different now than they were 50 years ago. But take it back a few thousand years ago, things didn't change that much in a generation. So it wasn't imperative for the new generation to change as much.
So how do you think there is any possible way that we could make a more sudden shift than intergenerational?
Yes, I do. Like, the society can always, life forms adapt to their environment or they perish. So there has been more change in my family over the last few generations than probably any other family in history.
Which there would have to be.
There would have to be, because it's a social imperative, or else the human species won't survive. If we build a society that evolves faster than we can adapt to it, and that's in terms of understanding and using our own technology that we created, not damaging and disrupting and destroying our own environment, which we are doing, we will die out, because we will literally burn our own culture to the ground, our own civilization to the ground, because there'll be no one left to run our own society. And this is something Carl Sagan talked about. He's like, who is making all these scientific decisions? Who are the people? Are you trusting the people in Congress, these 65-year-olds who have no scientific training whatsoever? They have no understanding of what's going on.
Yeah.
The cutting edge of science is being updated every 6 months, and it's...
So with that, you're saying, basically, yes, we can make a sudden shift. However,
it's far more difficult.
We have these values, even though we say we want this society. We were brought up in this way that encourages competition, encourages egotistical kind of thinking. And these things are so inherent within our behavior, in our personalities, that even if we don't believe in them, it's really hard not to behave a certain way because of the way we were brought up. And it could take a lifetime to actually overcome that. So to actually think that there is any chance that we can get a whole society to kind of shift that perception in a short amount of time before we need to, I'm not saying it can't be done, but I'm saying it's extremely optimistic to think it can be done. And I'm not saying that optimism is necessarily unrealistic, because I think there's another point to bring up. The last monthly movies, we talked about open source and that, and I showed that TED talk about the guy who talked about ideas having sex, and the fact that more people on the planet means that we have more ability to be creative, because we can actually share thoughts more. And with the added amount of communication that we have, the fact that we can communicate almost instantly from across the world means that these ideas can spread at a rate like never before. With 7 billion people on the planet, this amazing communication tool that we have, we can actually solve these problems in a much faster time than we've ever been able to do. So there's that side of it where you could say we're being optimistic is rational. But then there's that other side that I'm talking about where behaviors are so difficult to change.
Human behavior is a really interesting thing, and it does come back to the Robert Sapolsky lecture series. And the only way you can understand human behavior or understand any topic, for instance, is to be able to talk about it.
Yeah.
It has to not be something that is overlooked in your site-specific censoring of what topics are appropriate and not appropriate to talk about. So again, you have to be able to talk about and joke about human behavior, especially when you can understand human behavior. Then you can understand how you think, how you perceive the world. Why am I doing this? What is the purpose of my life? Why am I going to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week? Am I serving a greater purpose? Is this what I actually want? No. If you actually evaluate your own thoughts and your own mind, which, again, you should evaluate and critique everything. It's a universal rule. You don't leave any rock unturned. You can start to understand your own behavior. Once you understand your own behavior, you can form your behavior.
Do you think everyone has the ability to do that?
Well, how do you determine someone's ability? Is it are they gifted genetically or something?
No, I guess it's probably more to do with upbringing. Because, I think in my experience, the majority of people can. The majority of people, younger people in particular, like more my age and younger, have more ability to critically analyze their own behavior and modify that. Whereas I find people like in their 50s and 60s, they can still modify it, but I feel like in my experience that by that time, or maybe just because that generation wasn't taught to, they have less ability to think critically.
Well, yes.
About their own behavior,
There is a biological reason for that. Your brain forms in stages and matures, different parts mature in different stages. And there's a biological reason why teenagers, for instance, are more rebellious and so on. And there's a reason why people who are older and matured past 50 or so on are kind of set in their ways. It has to do with brain chemistry, bringing it back to something real, intangible. If you understand that, you can overcome it. Like, I'm really impressed, actually, that my mum, who's 61...
Do you think she'll appreciate you telling everyone that?
Doesn't matter. She started going to the gym recently.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, that's so awesome. She realized, exercise, that's really important. She was doing some before, but now she's like, I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week. There is a capacity for people to change their behavior. Obviously, it diminishes over time, but there's always a capacity to change. A good example is like improving your diet or something. Yeah. Like, if you've eaten like shit for 50 years, you've done irreversible damage. But it's still never too late to improve your diet. But if you're 18 and you've eaten shit for the first 18 years of your life, but then you eat really well from there on, you're going to have a much better life. You've done way less damage. Probably the damage can be repaired, and you have a much higher potential. So think of it as like, it's never too late to give up smoking. It's never too late to improve your diet. It's never too late to start exercising. Well, that's a little bit more grey.
I guess what I was talking about in terms of that generation that's between like 50 and 70, I wasn't so much talking about the chemical changes within their brain, the Robert Sapolsky stuff. I think I was more talking about the way they were brought up, because in my experience with most people around my age, if we talk about mental illness, for example, it is not taboo in my group of friends, or as taboo anymore, to have depression or anxiety and to openly tell people you do. To openly say, look, I have this disease, I have this thing that I have to deal with, and for people to be understanding about it, or to even, be able to share their own battles with mental illness, and to be empathetic towards that and so forth. Whereas I find I've even been in a situation where someone was being so cruel and mean, not just to me, but everyone around us. And someone said to me, because I wanted to address it, I said, look, I think this person has depression. And I think I can't really, I'm not a doctor. I can't actually diagnose that, but I think it would be worth checking out to see if we can do something about this, because I see a lot of signals that kind of make me think that, and then we can get help for him. But they're in that older generation, and his wife said to me, you know what? He's just an asshole. That's all he is. He's just an asshole. Just deal with it. And I'm like, okay, so it's more offensive. And they were offended that I thought that he might have depression. That the idea of having depression is more offensive to them than actually calling him an asshole. Because with calling someone an asshole, it actually means that you don't have any capacity to change that.
Well, it's a cop-out, and it's a less complex view. Like, as time goes on, we have a more complex view of how things work. And it's kind of like this infinite fractal of complexity where the further you go down, the further you learn about something. You can kind of explain, when you could explain some behavior in one sentence, now you can explain it in one paragraph kind of thing. And it gets more and more complicated, and our understanding gets more and more refined. So depression and human behavior, the actual cutting edge of what science knows is actually quite high on how to understand, predict, anticipate human behavior. But to say someone, oh, he's an asshole, that's a cop-out. That's like, well, I don't understand how it's happening, so I'm just going to say this kind of blanket term. And again, to bring it back to religion, God is very much that cop-out of non-explanation of something. How does that happen? Why does that happen? God did it. God did it. It's just a non-explanation. It's the least complex answer.
But I guess I kind of wanted to bring up the fact that I think people are really, in that age group, it was really taboo to be depressed. To actually have a mental illness, if you have depression or anxiety, you're basically crazy, which means you're a social outcast. So to actually suggest in that age group that they might have depression is the highest insult. So saying you're an asshole is less of an insult. And so that's why it's, in my opinion, difficult for that generation to change their behavior, because it's insulting to even suggest.
Yeah, I agree. I think saying someone's an asshole is a less complex suggestion, because saying someone has depression, that kind of opens up 3 or 4 more questions.
Yeah, like, oh, and you could actually do something about this.
Yeah, because saying someone's an asshole, oh, there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
Just an asshole.
But depression's like, oh, so you could be like slightly responsible, and you could actually make changes. So I guess, when I was talking before about how, I know the way that I should think. Oh, actually, this is a really awesome thing my housemate Tara said the other day. Basically, she's from a really religious upbringing, but I don't think she's religious anymore. Either that or she's getting closer to understanding the way I think in terms of being non-religious. But her point was, she said, the way you think about yourself, as in your self-esteem, this sounds really fucking sad, is almost as unrealistic as believing in God. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy. Like, as in, because I've been so indoctrinated to have a low self-worth, that even though that is not, that I shouldn't think that way because of all these really positive things, I still just dog myself out on an emotional level because of the way I was brought up. And that comes back to, like, even if you know rationally that you should think a certain way, you could think a certain way that would be more productive and lead to a better future. If you've been told as a child to think a certain way and you've had that done to you every single day, that behavior is extremely difficult to modify. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's hard. It takes a lot of work.
Yeah, just understanding an issue is not necessarily enough in addressing it. It is a lot of work to change human behavior. It's probably one of the hardest things. Like, for instance, I was addicted to food. I'm addicted to food. I love food. But I could know you don't actually want this. 5 minutes after finishing it, you're going to hate yourself and it's going to feel terrible. But I still do it anyway because you literally can't help yourself, because the impulse, the human behavior, the chemicals, hormones and so on, and the indoctrinated response to a certain stimulus is so strong. Even if you can consciously predict and be aware of what's happening and know you don't want that outcome, you can't censor your own behavior sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's what addiction is. Addiction is knowing, these cigarettes really aren't helping me. They're hurting my health, so on. They're expensive. They're unnecessary for anything, really.
Yeah,
but I literally cannot stop.
Yeah. And then you try and convince yourself that you can, and then you still can't.
And then what happens is you backwards rationalize after the fact, often, why you did it. Oh, it was because of the party. Oh, because of... And you justify, you justify that they're not that bad, or I only smoke like 10 a day, it's not a big deal. There's a lot of things that the human, because basically your brain is seeking a coherent version of reality. So you need to justify in your own mind why a behavior is happening. And if, I'll use the cigarette example, or even food, oh, it's because I was hungry. Oh, but you weren't really. Oh, because I just needed a sugar bump. I had a hard day. I was like tired. I just needed some soothing with some Tim Tams.
There was nothing else in the fridge.
It's because, and like, oh yeah, I was too lazy to cook anything decent.
Yeah.
Or like, no, I had a salad yesterday. You justify and you backwards rationalize your own behavior, even though deep down, or maybe subconsciously deep down, you understand what's really happening.
Yeah.
But because, again, you don't talk about it, you don't identify it, you can't address that behavior until you actually identify what is happening.
All right, so let's bring this. I still want to keep going back to this for some reason. Getting to a resource-based economy in terms of changing people's behavior, or people getting to understand their own behavior and change their own behavior, needs to be the first step, right, in order to make that move to a resource-based economy. So before, or does it? Actually, this is my question. Before, when there were horses and carts or whatever, and some awesome person decides to build a car, which is this amazing machine that requires half the effort. You don't need to feed the horses, and you can get somewhere much faster and whatever. Just like it really sped up efficiency within the whole system that we live in. Did people's behavior and perception about life need to change in order to make that huge revolution to this car that actually like completely changed the world? So my question is, do people need to actually catch up on an emotional, spiritual, whatever kind of level, or do we just implement the technology and then people just kind of go with it?
Two kind of answers. So one, technology generally drags culture kicking and screaming along with us. So people aren't generally ready for the technology, but it forces the cultural revolution to happen. Yeah. And that's true of horses and transitioning to cars. And it will be true in robotics, automation, and so on. We are not ready culturally for that, but it is going to happen because technology cannot be avoided. It is going to drag that culture in the direction that technology dictates.
So go.
But generally, if the culture doesn't know how to use or understand that technology, it will be misused and will not have the optimal or the most beneficial effect of that technology. So technology is not inherently good or bad. Technology is an expansion of tools. And if you have more tools, that does not necessarily mean an improvement. It means an improved capacity. Yeah. But if you have a culture that has its values in the wrong areas, more tools means more guns, more bombs and stuff as well.
Yeah, and I guess that's what Carl Sagan was talking about, with people not being educated with science and technology, or even understanding the scientific method. And so the people that actually make decisions about the technology that's implemented are kind of misguided, unethical, I guess, immoral kind of people who don't actually understand the way the world works. Or maybe they aren't unethical, but they just don't understand the way the world works.
Earlier we were talking about how to transition to a resource-based economy faster than an intergenerational change, because frankly an intergenerational change is not fast enough for the magnitude of problems we're dealing with.
Correct.
But how do you change ingrained human behavior, especially in older individuals, when their behavior has been ingrained for longer, reinforced for longer, and they have a less malleable and plastic brain chemistry?
Yeah.
It's very difficult, but it is possible.
How?
Well, you need how is it possible to change your human behavior? you have to understand it first. So, like, bringing it all the way back to the beginning of this podcast when we're talking about comedy and what is appropriate to joke about and not talk about. When you can joke about something, you can talk about it. Once you can talk about it, you can address it. Once you can address it, you can start solving it.
Yeah.
That is kind of the sequence that people need to go through. And
so do you reckon we should just like get a whole bunch of comedians out there and just start thrashing society and talking about how shit everything is all the time, and we should just fill our TVs with that?
there's every stage needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
So I think it is a good thing to have a culture that jokes about how it's so bullshit that the fucking 1% control the world. It's so ridiculous that we're destroying the environment. There's no need to. Isn't it amazingly dumb how we use coal when we could just use solar power and do no environmental damage?
Yeah.
They're the kind of things that need to be talked about. I think older people, it's far more difficult to change their behavior, but it is possible. It's difficult because they have ingrained traditions and culture and values, importantly. Changing people's values is very, very hard because they have a value where they generally trust the government. They generally toe the line. They generally are straight arrows in terms of activism. This is not all of them, by the way.
No way. We have a lot of people in the Zeitgeist movement that are well into their 50s and 60s. You know, there's even some people who have actually come along to several events and said things like, well, we're the ones that screwed up the world, so I feel like some kind of innate responsibility to actually do something about it. So, yeah, we're definitely talking on a completely, totally, and utterly general level.
Yes.
And there are plenty of awesome older Zeitgeist activists out there.
But it is a observable trend and a statistically significant observation because it is explained by brain chemistry and so on, how people's worlds become smaller and narrower as time goes on because you have less experiences. New experiences occur less. When you're younger, you have more novel experiences, and that opens you up to the world.
So what about these people that do fall through the gaps then, like some of our friends who are older in the Zeitgeist movement?
They are awesome.
Yeah, so they're like super awesome.
Yeah.
So more awesome than the younger people because they've actually had to deal with other people, their peers, their own age, who are just like the opposite of them. Man, I never thought about that.
And it depends on the level of indoctrination. So like, for instance, my mum, she's very, very open to new ideas, new things, but you can sense that innate connection with an older generation where the really radical ideas are probably not going to come from her. But if I were to say them, she would go, oh yeah, I can probably agree with that.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
But, again, my grandmother, who was born in 1928, who was a teenager in the Second World War, when there was rationing and there was Japanese attacking Darwin, she was, and still is, very stingy with her money, with her food, with her celebrations.
Yeah.
Because she still has a perception that at war times you need to save, you need to be stingy, whereas different generations have different environments they're brought up into, and that guides their behavior sometimes forever after.
And it could even be, like with your grandmother's situation, more than just stuck in that way because it's wartime, but actually that would be a value of hers to actually say, well, you should be like that too. You should actually be stingy too because, you know, at any moment we could end up in that situation again.
I don't know if it's as conscious as that, but it is something that values are kind of interesting. Values don't necessarily make any logical sense, but they're something that we hold on to probably more than anything else. Another barrier to older people changing their behavior is where those values came from and whether it was beneficial or not. So, for instance, someone who has trauma and they're dealing with that trauma in a certain value, it's going to be very difficult for them to change that value if you never address the trauma that produced it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's even relevant for younger people.
And especially for older people because it's more ingrained and they've always used whatever behavior and the value behind that behavior to cope with the trauma that they experienced. Especially childhood trauma guides behavior later in life, big time.
Yeah, so they would take up smoking or drinking or whatever it is in order to cope with that trauma that they've never really been able to deal with, you know, on a realistic kind of level.
If you experience something and the way you coped at the time, let's say you had something bad happen to you when you were 10 years old or something, no matter what it is, and how you dealt with that was you smoked weed. and you felt good when you smoked weed, and then something bad happened, and to get better, you would smoke weed.
Yeah.
And you would use that as your tool for feeling better.
Yeah.
Much later in life, you would expect to see someone like that to have a problem with drugs and weed in particular.
Yeah.
Because that was the tool they used. So it's going to be far more difficult for that person to give up that drug addiction than it would be someone who just uses weed. Oh, I love it. It makes me feel good.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Because there's no barrier for them to stop using it.
Yeah, right.
Whereas with someone else, it is part of their response mechanism to deal with that trauma. Whenever they feel bad, they associate weed with feeling good.
All right, so I guess we've talked about a lot of things today, hey?
Yeah, I think we've had a good chat. We've covered a lot of interesting topics. Talked about technology. We've plugged the media festival. We've talked about human behavior, especially the biological effects, addiction. I think we've done a good podcast. Should we leave it at that?
I think that's a good idea, yeah. Just basically leave it at that. And, the fact that we can work towards an RBE still, and it is still possible. There are several different ways that we could get there, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Please post below.
Yes, and we would like to hear from some of the older people as well, to hear your thoughts on what comments that we made.
Some success stories about changing your behavior or giving up an addiction later in life.
Yeah, and what it's like being part of that generation.
Thanks, bye.
Yeah, thanks. Hope you guys enjoyed the podcast.